How's it going, guys and geeks? Welcome to Geekritique. My name is Dakota, and you're watching our second entry in our Timeline Journal series. A series where we literally open up our journal and show you what projects we're working on, namely our timeline projects. Now, many of you have found us through our MCU Timeline videos, which is awesome, but this tends to mean that other videos of different topics don't tend to do very well. Like our Star Wars content bombs pretty much every time, so please be sure to like this video so that that doesn't happen in this video, because we're going to be talking a lot about our Star Wars timeline that we're currently working on. Now, while this video is dedicated specifically to what we're working on in our Star Wars timeline, that doesn't mean that we won't be talking about MCU content, specifically Eternals and where we think it's going to be taking place on our MCU timeline. Now, we know that Eternals takes place over a 7,000 year period, but we'll talk more about that at the end of the video after we cover our Star Wars stuff. Now, please note that the timeline on this screen is a literal timeline, and you may start seeing this incorporated in other timelines, not just our Star Wars content. So if this proves popular on our channel, we'll probably incorporate it into our MCU timeline at some future date. But the Star Wars timeline is unique, and we need to explain how exactly it works. Now, there are no official dates within the Star Wars canon. We know that they have many different calendars based on different time zones and galactic standards and planets and stuff. There's a Lothal calendar, there's a Coruscant calendar, but we aren't privileged to know what year exactly each event takes place in terms of what the people of the universe actually consider the standard year. So as outsiders looking in, we have to find a point on their calendar so as to begin counting front and back. To explain BBY and ABY, we have to look at our own actual timeline and note that we are in AD 2021. That means Anno Domini, Year of Our Lord in Latin, 2021. So that means that Jesus Christ presumably was born at the 0 year, even though he was actually born a little bit later than that. And before that was BC. So we count backwards from there and forwards from the 0 mark. Now in Star Wars, instead of choosing a point based on somebody's birth, we actually want to base it on the Battle of Yavin, which is a historical point in the Star Wars universe where the first Death Star exploded. So everything after that will be ABY, after the Battle of Yavin, and everything before that is counted backwards, BBY, before the Battle of Yavin. Now you'll notice there's no particular 0 year on the Star Wars calendar. It's actually 1 BBY, and then a year later it's 1 ABY. So we actually use a 6-month increment to calculate 0 ABY and BBY. Sometime in the middle of that year, between years 1 BBY and 1 ABY, is where the Battle of Yavin took place, and that's where we push our timeline frontwards and backwards from there. So naturally, because the first Death Star blew up in the first Star Wars movie, Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, we begin our journey in 0 BBY and then move over into ABY after the Death Star. Episode 5 takes place 3 years later in 3 ABY. The Rebels are still on the run, and yeah, you guessed it, the Empire strikes back. 1 year after that, we have Return of the Jedi, Episode 6, and that's when the Battle of Endor happens, where they destroy the second Death Star. So, spoilers, obviously, if you haven't seen any of Star Wars, but, you know, you should probably get on that. The second trilogy of Star Wars films takes place before the original trilogy, specifically 32 years before the Battle of Yavin. So, The Phantom Menace, the first episode in the Skywalker saga, takes place 32 BBY. 10 years pass as Obi-Wan trains young Anakin, and Attack of the Clones takes place in 22 BBY. And then 3 years after Attack of the Clones, which is Episode 2, we have Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, which occurs in 19 BBY. So 19 years before the Death Star blows up. Next, we jump forward into our sequel trilogy, where we have Episodes 7 and 8, The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, taking place back-to-back in 34 ABY. And then a year later, presumably, we have The Rise of Skywalker in 35 ABY. We also have the 2 anthology films that came out around the time of the sequels, which is Rogue One, which takes place just before the Death Star blows up, so 0 BBY. And then we have Solo, A Star Wars Story, which takes place 10 years before the Death Star blows up, and that would be 10 BBY, with a short prologue and 13 BBY. And that is a very basic understanding of how the Star Wars timeline works based on where the films sit on the timeline. Now it's our job, or my job specifically, to start inhabiting this timeline with books, comics, audio dramas, video games, graphic novels, TV shows, and more, so that you can start to see a bigger picture opening up of the Star Wars galaxy at large. And yes, I know that all of Star Wars is already mapped out chronologically. That's not in question. I know Star Wars Explained just did an amazing breakdown of the entire history of the canon Star Wars universe, but what I want to do is a little bit different. Mine is more of a reading and watching order in terms of when you need to watch this, and this to get a chronological experience. And yes, I could go to Wikipedia and, just jot down where everything takes place, but I wouldn't be able to express why certain things take place in certain areas if I did that. So I'm going to be going title by title, comic by comic, and actually putting everything on the timeline as I go, instead of just, listing everything that I don't know. Because that's how we did our MCU timeline, and that's how we're going to do our Star Wars timeline. Just want to give a quick spoiler warning. All these things, we're going to have to talk a little bit about their plot and spoilers, just so that we get a glimpse as to where and why they fit where they do on this timeline. So just be wary of that. That being said, we're going to be starting our inhabiting of this timeline with The Bad Batch, which is the new series that's debuting on Disney Plus right now. It follows the events of the Clone Wars and Revenge of the Sith pretty closely. In fact, it begins at Order 66. Now, Order 66 was the command given by Palpatine to trick the clones, or rather rewire the clones into attacking the Jedi, which brought down the Republic and paved the way for the Empire to take over. And what's so cool about the Bad Batch in particular is how quickly we get to see the Empire take over and change things. We have, it's probably been less than a week over the course of the first 5 episodes since Order 66 has been ordered and the clones started attacking Jedi. But we already see that the Empire is requiring new registration, new types of credits. There's power vacuums that are opening up. Crime syndicates are taking over. We have the Zygarians, which were introduced in Season 4 of Clone Wars, that they once had a very prosperous slave trade empire that the Republic kind of stamped out, along with the Jedi back in the day. But now that there is no Republic, there are no Jedi, the Zygarians have, swooped in and taken over some of that power vacuum left by the Republic, and they're starting their slave trade up again, which is crazy and sick, but it just goes to show how dangerous the Empire is to the galaxy. And that's probably one of the coolest things so far about the Bad Batch for me, is exactly what's happening behind the scenes and what's happening in the forefront of the galaxy. So it's really cool. I love all the characters in the show. That takes place in 19 BBY, so just shortly after the events of Revenge of the Sith. And it seems to chronologically fit just after the Clone Wars as well. What I like about The Bad Batch is that it seems to be merging the storytelling ability of Rebels, which is a very linear storyline, a serialized storyline, and taking the clone aspect from the Clone Wars and merging it together to bridge the Clone Wars era and the Rebels era together. It's really cool. So now we're moving away from The Bad Batch, and we're talking more about novels and comics that we've read in the past couple weeks since our first timeline journal, that we can now put on this timeline that we've created for ourselves, so we can start inhabiting this image, basically, that will be used in our future Star Wars timeline. Now, please note that the timeline journal is a Patreon first thing, so our patrons over there get this video 2 days early, as well as a high quality JPEG of our most recent version of this timeline. So any and all updates that we put onto our timeline currently, we're also going to be sharing that directly with our patrons, so they get access to that. But we did read a lot of new Star Wars novels in the past couple weeks since our first timeline journal. Most notably, 2 Padme novels written by E.K. Johnston and 2 Leia novels written by Claudia Gray. And we're going to be talking a little bit about that. Now, I have read some of these before, but I'm rereading and reading anew all of the Star Wars canon over the next year or so. So bear with me. We're going to be adding a bunch of these in this timeline series. But we're going to be starting in 32 BBY, which is where the prequel novel to the Padme series actually occurs. So E.K. Johnston did the Star Wars thing, where she made the first novel the middle entry in the series, then the prequel novel, which is the second entry in the series, and she's currently writing the third novel, which is the sequel entry into the series. So it's a series specifically about Padme Amidala, or Padme Naberi, and her journey from Queen to Senator to, Senator in the Clone Wars. In this first novel, Queen's Peril, takes place 32 BBY, or just shortly before The Phantom Menace occurs. So Queen's Peril is the novel that talks about her becoming the elected Queen of Naboo at the young age of 14, and how Captain Panaka, her security enforcer, hired all these different handmaidens according to Padme's wishes. You know, she wanted 5 instead of just 1 or 2. And how that eventually aided in her ability to make a decoy of herself in The Phantom Menace. So it actually goes to show like all the skills of the different handmaidens, how close they all became, and basically how it would shape Padme into becoming the woman that she would become later on. And it's a really cool read. It's not my favorite of the books that I did read this time around, and it's not even my favorite of the Padme books, but it's really interesting, and I love the fact that we're getting more about her time before that. And the novel goes into the invasion of Naboo, which is really cool to me, and it talks a little bit about some of the events that occur in The Phantom Menace, so it overlaps a little bit there. So the book occurs over 3 to 4 months. Jumping right into the first novel in the series, or the sequel to Queen's Peril, Queen's Shadow, we start our journey in 28 BBY, so 4 years after the fact. Now, Queen Amidala has now served 2 terms. Each term on Naboo is 2 years, and she contractually or constitutionally can no longer run for a 3rd term, even though others are trying to get her to keep running because she did such a great job with the invasion of Naboo and so on. The next elected queen wants her to become a senator. Because we have Chancellor Palpatine now, no longer senator, that spot is open for her to now inhabit. Queen Amidala takes that next step and becomes Senator Amidala. She keeps her name. This book covers like a 9-month period. I think it's a little bit better than Queen's Peril, actually. I like it a lot more. And it talks more about how she's beginning her senatorial duties on Coruscant, how she's still like under fire from the Trade Federation even at this early stage. And this takes place a good 6 years before Attack of the Clones. So it's just her beginning her senator duties and, you know, befriending Bail Organa and Mon Mothma and all these individuals. So I really like this book. I highly recommend it. E.K. Johnston did a really good job with Queen's Shadow. It's worth noting that both Queen's Peril and Queen's Shadow have epilogues that jump forward in time quite drastically. So while Queen's Peril takes place in 32 BBY, we have an epilogue that takes place in 0 ABY that kind of parallels Queen Amidala and Princess Leia at the medal ceremony in episode 4. And in Queen's Shadow, we have an epilogue that, you know, jumps forward to 19 BBY to Padme Amidala's funeral. And, you know, it's a fantastic bridge thematically for both books. I really appreciate that. Of all things in the book, I appreciate the way it ends. Now perhaps my favorite novel that I read in this batch, Claudia Gray's Leia, Princess of Alderaan. It's a young adult novel that takes place in 3 BBY, so 3 years before the Battle of Yavin. A very young Princess Leia is just turning 16. She's doing her ceremonial rites of Princess of Alderaan at the age of 16, which is her Day of Demand, where she, you know, lists off the things that she needs to do to be worthy of the title of Queen eventually, which is like a trial of the mind, the body, and the heart. And the book is fantastic. It goes into how she discovers the evils of the Empire, how she discovers her parents are involved with the rebellion, and ultimately how she gets involved. Now, I don't want to give too many spoilers away, but this is a book that you guys should definitely read. Highly recommend it. And Tarkin. There's some of the best Tarkin stuff in Leia, Princess of Alderaan. Claudia Gray is a fantastic author when it comes to Star Wars. She's written 5 books now, and all of them are top-notch Star Wars. With our next title, Bloodline, you can probably start to piece together that I was kind of going through a theme of, you know, the mother and daughter sort of thing, where I was going through Padme's stuff and now I'm going through Leia's stuff. So Bloodline takes place in 28 BBY, so about 24 years after Return of the Jedi. And Princess Leia is now a senator in the New Republic, and it's kind of a book about the divided party lines and how the New Republic doesn't get anything done, and how the promises that they made when they took over after the Empire aren't being fulfilled. So she, Princess Leia, and someone else, and a team of individuals start looking into these crime syndicates and discover a major force in the galaxy that, they don't know it, but would eventually become the First Order. It's a really interesting read, and it bridges what we know of the New Republic era with the First Order era of the sequel trilogy. I don't think that they did a fantastic job of, incorporating the First Order elements into it, just because it is a little bit confusing as to what actually is shown to us. But I appreciate the book, and I also think that this is a fantastic book because we're introduced to the reason why she's no longer a senator in the sequel trilogy, which is because the Senate discovers her true origins as Vader's daughter, and it's the implications that are involved with that and her family and stuff that are just so fascinating, and it's such a good read. Claudia Gray, again, I love her Star Wars. It's so good. Another really awesome book that I read was Force Collector, which presumably takes place in 30 ABY, so about 26 years after the Return of the Jedi, or 2 years after Bloodline. It's about a young boy named Kar Nuk-Sin who has Force abilities, but he's not sure how to develop them because, at this point in the galaxy, Luke Skywalker isn't, training any Jedi. The First Order is coming into power, and basically all he knows how to do is touch objects and get Force visions from them. This is a type of Force power called psychometry. We've seen it a couple times. We know that Rey had a little vision when she touched Luke and Anakin's lightsaber back in The Force Awakens. That was psychometry. We also have Quinlan Vos back in the Clone Wars era and Dark Disciple and stuff, who was able to touch items and reach and read their past. But this seems to be the only thing that Kar is good at, and so he's trying to learn the Force and the history of the Jedi through these different items that he picks up. So he's looking for items that are powerfully connected to the Force, and it takes him on a journey that helps him understand the bigger Star Wars timeline. And it's such a fantastic read because it reminds me of myself and other fans who are interested in the lore and just learning different things about the Star Wars galaxy and picking things apart so that we can learn the bigger picture. Ultimately, it's not our story, and that's what Kar comes to realize, is that, even though all these cool things have happened in Star Wars, that doesn't mean it's their story. So this is the book about how he figures out what his path is. And I thought that was a really, really cool way to, talk about Star Wars from an in-canon. We started rereading the comics. This is the 2015 Star Wars run, Volume 1, Skywalker Strikes. It takes place maybe a week after the Death Star blows up, and the Rebels are still, hammering the Empire. They're trying to get ahead while the Empire's down, and they're going to different industrial plants and shipyards, and they're just blowing random things up. So we see our Rebels that we know and love, Han, Luke, and Leia, visit Simoon 1, where they destroy an Imperial factory. In this comic, we have Vader hiring Boba Fett to figure out who it was that blew up the Death Star. He knows it's someone from Tatooine or whatever, but he doesn't know who it is. So the graphic novel finishes with Vader finding out that it was Skywalker, and the implications of what that means, that there is another Skywalker out there. So this is really cool because we're actually getting Vader discovering that one of his children is still alive. And that's all the Star Wars stuff that we're going to be talking about today, but I hope you enjoyed the Star Wars discussion. Again, our patrons get access to a full JPEG of the most recent timeline that we have. So I appreciate your patronage. Now we're going to jump into Marvel, and specifically the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and Eternals. Now, a couple weeks from now, we're going to have to do another video. Our next timeline journal will probably be half Star Wars and half Loki, because Loki's going to be so timeline intensive. But for now, we can talk a little bit about the Eternals trailer that came out this past week. I already made a video about it. You probably already saw it. If you haven't, you can click this card right here and check that out after this video, whatever. But we broke down some of the historical beats in that trailer, and as we know from Kevin Feige, the film occurs over a period of 7,000 years. So this is by far the earliest earthly history that we've seen from the MCU. But now where do we place that on our chronological viewing timeline? Because if the major events in the third act take place after, say, Avengers Endgame, it doesn't make sense for us to place that 7,000 years ago on the timeline. Based on what the end of the trailer is suggesting, this would probably take place after Falcon and the Winter Soldier. And we know this because she doesn't call Steve Rogers Captain America, she calls him Captain Rogers. Understandably, knowing that Falcon, or Sam Wilson, is the new Captain America. So instead of saying Captain America and Iron Man are gone, she says Captain Rogers is gone, along with Iron Man. So we know that that probably means it takes place after Falcon and the Winter Soldier at some point. If that scene takes place during the actual film, maybe the third act, then we would have to place our timeline after Falcon and the Winter Soldier at that point. Obviously, we don't know that it is actually after Falcon and the Winter Soldier, but we do know that it's after Endgame, that particular scene. So for now, we're tentatively going to be placing our Eternals title on the timeline after Falcon and the Winter Soldier and maybe before Spider-Man Far From Home. I guess it all depends on when exactly that scene takes place, because if it's an after credit scene, then we won't use that to measure where this fits on the timeline, basically. So we'll see. I doubt it's an after credit scene though, or a post credit scene. So that concludes our timeline journal entry number 2. Next time you'll see me, we'll be talking more Star Wars, like I said, more Marvel. We're probably going to be talking more about Frozen, because I plan on releasing our Frozen timeline pretty soon. And Jen's actually going to help me out with that, so I'm very happy that we get to do a video together again. If you guys don't already know, I am one half of the podcast hosts of Project Geekology. It's a new podcast where we basically like go into different films and novels and just, you know, talk about each of the most important beats and, you know, dissect what works about it and what doesn't work. Right now we're doing a 6-part series on the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It's my favorite film series of all time. Please be sure to check that out if you like the Lord of the Rings, obviously. But check out the podcast in general. We'll leave a link in the description down below. Again, thank you for watching up to this point. 761 likes until we get our next geek level up. So please like this video and comment your thoughts on any of the titles or topics that we discussed today. I'd love to hear them. I will be responding to each and every one of them. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.